Hey.
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 Let's talk.
Let's talk on Fridays.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Let's Talk on Fridays. I'm joined by former Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson, and Governor Carlson was governor of Minnesota from 1991 until 1999. He was also Minnesota State Auditor for 10 years before that, so he's an expert on Minnesota budgets. Governor Carlson, thank you for joining me.
Delighted, thank you.
You know, everyone knows that Minnesota is in a shutdown because lawmakers couldn't agree on a budget deal because of the budget shortfall. But I think that many people believe that the poor economy is the sole reason why that we're in this situation, this budget crisis. But you say there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, the problem, frankly, started in roughly 2002 when Jesse Ventura, as governor, submitted, quote, the big plan. Well, it was a big plan. What it basically did was shift a lot of the property tax burden for schools onto the state as a state responsibility. And in order to pay for that shift, he proposed widening the sales tax. The Republicans in the House, at that time led by Majority Leader Tim Plenty, said we like the idea of taking the school burden off the property tax and shifting it to the state, but we don't like the idea of the tax increase. That's ultimately what prevailed, with both parties supporting it. But it should be noted that Majority Leader Moe in the Senate and Larry Pogemiller, the head of finance, both strongly opposed it. I remember their comments. But nevertheless, legislators love a tax cut, and they hope that the economy will grow so that they don't have to cover the deficit. Well, the economy did grow, but the deficit also grew. And from there on in, when Plenty became governor, we started this borrowing and shifting. It started in 2003 with $1 billion from the tobacco fund. Then it got into accounting shifts. Then it got into we're going to have inflation on the revenue side, but we're taking inflation out of the spending side. I mean, all sorts of gimmicks, if you will. And suffice it to say, it led ultimately to $2+ billion being borrowed from federal stimulus monies, and we kept borrowing to sustain a spending system, refusing to make the tough choices. The tough choices are simple in a budget. Either you cut spending, or you cut taxes, or you do a bit of both. Those are your choices.
So you're saying we've been
the worst choice is to borrow, and that's what we did.
You're saying that there's been a lot of budget gimmickry going on in Minnesota budgets since when? Since Ventura?
No, it really started in 2003 with Governor Plenty. As a matter of fact, during those years, the National Council on State Legislators put out a report citing Minnesota as #2 in the United States in using budget gimmickry. Oddly enough, Alaska was #1. And it's interesting, both states are producing presidential candidates.
We hear a lot, during this debate, we hear a lot about how important tax rates are, and taxes and business rates. They talk about how we need to make sure that our tax rates are competitive, but you say that there's a myth related to businesses and taxes. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, anytime a debate gets into the political arena has a tendency to simplify everything. If you lower taxes, it stands to reason you're going to have fantastic job growth. Well, you know what? Taxes have been lowered. If you look at the impact of the Bush tax cut versus the higher taxes under Clinton, who grew more jobs? Whose economy was more successful? It was the Clinton. And the reason is that there's a whole variety of other factors at play. For Minnesota, for instance, I would argue that our great strength has been education, both on the K through 12 and on the higher education side. And don't underestimate the potency of research at the universities and in the industries that feed off that research. Everything from 3M to medical device companies, research companies, etc. That's very, very potent. I've sat on various corporate boards, and I can tell you, one, we do obviously consider tax burden. There's no question about that. But is it the only item, or is it even the lead item? My argument is absolutely not. There's a whole variety of factors ranging from transportation to the quality of the human product that comes into our company.
MinnesotaCare was a healthcare program created when you were in office in the 1990s.
That's correct.
The program is designed to help provide government-subsidized healthcare for individuals and families who can't get or don't have health insurance through their employers. Under the Republican plan, MinnesotaCare would be shrunk significantly. Can you share your thoughts on MinnesotaCare and your thoughts on the idea that shrinking MinnesotaCare will shrink the Health and Human Services portion of Minnesota's budget, a portion that seems to be growing unsustainably?
Well, first of all, MinnesotaCare was a response to two needs. One, we had a number of people that were left uninsured. Anything from a small farmer, small business person, to the student. Oddly enough, the student was the biggest part of the population. People don't realize that. But students, when they became 21, and before they entered the job market, that was a large group. And we all know that young people never get sick. But obviously also designed to help the working poor, particularly single mothers. So on a bipartisan basis, and I want to stress the phrase bipartisan because Democrats and Republicans really from the legislature with our administration really came together and designed that program. You had the benefit of a pooled approach which lowered the cost of the premiums, and then based on a sliding scale of need, the states subsidized that. Well, the result was that we and Hawaii led the nation in the fewest number of people that were uninsured. It was a very successful program. Now what the proposal is to voucherize it, i.e. skim off the bottom part of the income scale that's in MinnesotaCare, give them vouchers, and they can go on the private market and pay. Well,
so the bottom part meaning the most poor?
Yes, the lower incomes. So the result is what happens is that, one, they have to pay premiums without the benefit of the pooled reduction. So you don't get the benefit of this huge purchasing power. The second thing is, how do they afford it? And so the kinds of policies you'll get will have $2,000, $3,000 worth of deductibles, and anybody making $22,000, $25,000 a year, you can't afford it. I gave a talk a month and a half or 2 months ago and suggested that if the legislature is serious about this approach, they should apply it to themselves first, see how it works for 2 years. And then they can come back and say, gee, it's a resounding success or a failure. But don't experiment with other people's lives. And to Governor Dayton's credit, he has made certain that he's going to protect that.
You know, you've said, as we've talked before, that there's an opportunity. We're in a crisis right now, but you say there's an opportunity in that crisis. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Well, the opportunity comes in the word reform. But you have to understand that if you reform something today, you don't get an instant savings tomorrow. And you got to be careful about expectations and managing expectations. And frankly, not all reform leads to lower costs. But what you hope it leads to is greater efficiency. That's what you're after, productivity. I would like to see the governor and the legislature create a commission and give them approximately a year to start taking a look at, one, all the cost drivers in the system. You touched upon healthcare, but education is a cost driver. Transportation is a cost driver. Environment, by the way, is a cost driver. They all become cost drivers. Review everything and put it on the table with options. Here's how we think this area can operate more effectively, more efficiently, etc. One of the biggest cost drivers in the system is that if you understand state government finance, roughly 85% of the money that comes into the state goes out to local counties, school districts, municipalities, special districts, etc.
Sure.
Now, we in Minnesota have 87 counties. We got to ask the question, do we need 87 counties? Ohio, I think, has 88. So why do we need 87? We have over 400 plus school districts, police departments, municipalities. Do we need all that? No, we don't. Can we consolidate? The problem you run into is we love local control, and that's a virtue in the American system. But then we also love the idea of somebody else paying for that local control. Well, that somebody else is rapidly disappearing. So if we want all this local control, then we're going to have to figure out a strategy whereby we pay for it. And my guess is we can do a lot of consolidation. So I do think that this crisis represents a tremendous opportunity for the governor and legislature to come together, build a reform commission, and in about a year, listen to their responses. But don't expect financial results overnight. That won't happen.
Okay. You know, we talked about how in a situation like this that's so partisan, you had talked about how this is a real opportunity for independent-minded individual legislators to sort of step up. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm tired, both on the national and on the state level, of hearing these caucuses. I have to do what my caucus does. Let me ask you a question. You've interviewed many people. Have you ever heard a single legislator, a single candidate for Congress, come before you or any group that you're ever aware of and say, elect me and I'm going to give my vote to the caucus?
No.
Or elect me and I'm going to give my vote to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party?
No. They don't do that. So
why don't they, when they get into office, realize who they represent? They're not there to represent the caucus. They're not there to represent an interest group. Mm-hmm. They're not there to represent their party. They're there to represent the best interest of their community and their state. And that's what's fallen apart.
Minnesota runs on a 2-year budget. You say Minnesota has about a $3 billion structural deficit, which means that after this year's budget shutdown is done, the problem doesn't go away. Does that mean that 2 years from now we're going to be facing a similar situation?
Yes, that's exactly correct. Now, a lot depends on how you structure the settlement. The group that I know you want to touch on later is the group that Walter Mondale and I selected to put together a report as a third alternative. So we may as well get into that. If that alternative is adopted, that would eliminate the school shift of $1.4 billion. So that automatically takes a large piece of the structural deficit off the table and makes it a lot easier to deal with the ongoing deficit.
Because I think a lot, logically people were probably thinking that the problems that we're going through now are being made, are so difficult because they're trying to solve it once and for all. But we're just trying to get through to the next budget.
Yeah, and we better start thinking a little better in terms of the long term. Let me give you an example. If you've got a spending system that's up here and you prop it up with $2 billion of one-time money, what happens to the spending system when the $2 billion disappears? The spending system still goes on, but it's minus $2 billion in revenue, and that's frankly what's been happening.
Okay. We might as well talk about, you mentioned the group that you and Vice President Walter Mondale organized, an outside group of former political all-stars and economic experts who come together to operate without political constraints. The recommendations have come out, and they were met pretty warmly by Governor Dayton. He liked most of it with the exception of the 4% tax increase on everybody, income tax increase on everyone, and generally warmly by other Democrats, but Republicans do not like it. GOP House Speaker Kurt Zellers doesn't like the $1.29 per pack cigarette increase. He doesn't like the alcohol tax increase or the 4% income tax increase on all Minnesotans. Zeller says, quote, "It's not a solution, it's a retread of failed tax and spend policies." What do you say?
Well, the commission didn't create this financial mess. As a matter of fact, every legislative negotiator was part and has part responsibility for this mess because they were in the legislature prior to this year. So they should assume a little more responsibility than they are. I'm being rather blunt. But let me explain what the proposal does. First of all, it's a 4% surcharge on your income tax. So it's not a 4% tax increase on income, it's a 4% surcharge. Republicans in the past have supported surcharges on health care. So they're very familiar with the use of surcharges. So I think once they understand what the options are, they may get a little warmer to it. 2, it eliminates that $1.4 billion that the Republican plan takes from K through 12 education. That's something they don't talk about. But it's essential that we get rid of our debts. We have to pay our debts. We just can't simply pretend that they don't exist. The third part is that, yes, it's a tax on tobacco and alcohol. And we have routinely done that except for the last 15 years. But bear in mind, who picks up the costs of the damage caused by overconsumption of alcohol and cigarettes?
The healthcare system.
That's correct. And then they complain about the cost of the healthcare system. What the Republicans have to understand is that their own proposal contains significant tax increases, something they have been reluctant to talk about. First of all, it's a $400 million increase on the property tax side. Two, when you eliminate MinnesotaCare for many people, that will put at a minimum 85,000 people outside the healthcare system. Now, you'll recall when Exxon executives testified in Congress and said, if you eliminate our subsidy, that's going to be a tax increase. A lot of Republicans agreed. Well, if you eliminate the subsidy for MinnesotaCare for the lower income families, isn't that also then a tax increase? And then you get the elimination of much of the renter's tax credit. So that's a tax increase for them. So to be fair, what you should do is take the governor's budget and his proposal and his tax increases and look at it, and then take the Republican proposal and their tax increases and their spending and look at it, and then evaluate the best. I think the proposal that comes out of this third commission is by far the best. And take a look at who sat on that commission. It's something the media really hasn't paid much attention to. First of all, two former Democrat-Republican finance commissioners. Both have a reputation of excellence. Two legislators, Wayne Simoneau and Scott Dill, Senator Dill, all experience in budgets. One a Republican, one a Democrat. Then two business leaders, and people forget that. One who was the CEO of Wells Fargo, and the other who was vice president of Medtronic, knows about how do you grow companies and create employment opportunities, but also now is in the venture capital business for healthcare. These are very knowledgeable people, and the entire group came unanimously to that decision.
You know, were you surprised at how it seems like many Republicans are just kind of scoffing it off or just kind of tossing it aside? How do you feel the process of the third group exercise? How has that gone from your perspective?
Well, I think if there were a mistake, the mistake is that when the commission had a report, they should have held a news conference and explained it. Because once you fail to explain what your proposal is, others will explain it for you. And it depends on what eyes look at it.
Okay. You seem, your point of view on many of these things seems at odds with many of the Republican Party in Minnesota.
That's absolutely correct.
And you've caught a lot of flack from Republicans.
Yes, absolutely.
Have you changed as a Republican, or have the Republicans that are in the Minnesota legislature, have they changed?
I think anywhere you walk, you just find old conservative Republicans just shaking their heads in dismay. And that is because what brought the old Republican Party together was a tremendous respect for balanced budgets, tremendous respect for transparency, the right of the public to know, and a deep respect for public service. The last Republican president to balance the federal budget was Dwight David Eisenhower in the 1950s. We've had a lot of talk since, but no balanced budgets on the Republican side. I would like to see the Republican Party once and for all face up to the fact, yes, we are divided. There's no question about it. And you see that division in Washington. Speaker Boehner can no longer speak for his own Republican caucus. That's how divided they are.
Okay.
And what you have, I would argue, is a very irresponsible attitude towards finance. One, not raising the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling was never controversial. Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, Democratic Congresses, Republican Congresses, all routinely raised it. Why? Because you're simply paying debt. You are paying off the promises that you made. You're keeping your promise. I thought the wonderful article by Brooks in the New York Times was excellent, and he used some pretty strong language on what is now the prevailing opinion in the Republican Party. I'd like to see the Republican Party come back and be the party of balanced budgets, old-fashioned conservatism, legitimate debates on what is or what is not a government responsibility, and if it is a government responsibility, on what level of government should it be, local, state, federal, and cost efficiencies. That's been our strength, and I'd like to see us get back to that.
You know, and we talked before about kind of moving Minnesota forward, which is kind of what you're saying needs to be the perspective and the main sort of mentality and thought process that happens as you're going through this budget. And you said that there's some things that you just should not do. You said cutting things like stem cell research is the exact kind of thing you shouldn't do. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we ought not to impose our religious views on a civic budget. Once, for instance, you send out even the tonality of stem cell that you're going to cut or eliminate stem cell research, I'll guarantee you, you're causing a tremendous amount of economic harm to this state. At the University of Minnesota, I'm on a committee that's led by Carl Plateau. Walter Mondale is on that committee, and that's how I've gotten really to know him. Win Wallen was the head of it until he died, and now it's been taken over by Bob Pollard. The goal, and they've already realized it, is to raise $300 million for medical research. The university was able to bring in Doris Taylor, whose goal is to replicate the human organ. I mean, that's a remarkable, remarkable advancement. The other part is to grow stem cell research. Right now, one of our biggest competitors in this region is Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. I think they pledged, I may be wrong, something in the vicinity of $500 million. So they're already ahead of us on the financial front. Once Minnesota says we're no longer interested in stem cell research, I'll guarantee you we'll lose Doris Taylor, we'll lose our best researchers, we'll cause severe damage to the University of Minnesota. And I don't want to speculate on the damage to the Mayo Clinic, but I don't think they'll be particularly tickled pink with it either.
Okay. You also said, you know, you talked about where Minnesota is compared to where we used to be, and you said that it's time for some humility in Minnesota.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Well, when I came to Minnesota in the fall of 1957, one of my first trips, believe it or not, was right here, to Rochester to see the Mayo Clinic. And just walking around that clinic was awesome. And I remember going into the museum. People don't realize, we tend to take it for granted. Minnesota is home to some of the best advancements in the history of mankind, including the Mayo Clinic. And then the University of Minnesota, walking over by the Wangenstein and realizing that transplants really, we were the ones who trained Christian Barnard in the first transplant operation. The work of Dr. Lillihei, I mean, Wangenstein, these are famous, famous names. And then the growth of our companies, the blessings of so many Fortune 500 companies to be in Minnesota and the leadership they provided. We were, all during the 50s, 60s, 70s, we were a state that wanted to be discovered. And when Wendell Anderson's picture was on Time magazine, described as the state that worked, you know, holding up that fish, I think it's fair to say all of us, regardless of our partisan feelings, celebrated. We've been recognized. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. And we ought not to take the hard work that recognition took for granted. And I think what we're doing now is we're trying to live off the fat of the past, and we're trying to advance thought processes that reflect, frankly, a lack of substance. And our political system has to mature and mature very, very quickly because we're in global competition. If we continue this idea that we're going to cut on education, we're going to cut on higher education, that's going to be reflected in our economy almost immediately. Because I can tell you this, every other country is growing fast. Mm-hmm. And we don't test out that well when we compare ourselves to other industrial competitors. We understand competition in football, we understand competition in baseball, we better understand it in economics.
You say that democracy is about compromise.
Right.
And obviously that is an important point to think about in Minnesota right now with the shutdown. What do you mean by a democracy is about compromise?
If you can't compromise, you should not be in public office. It's as simple as that. You shouldn't get into a marriage. You should avoid human relationships. Give and take is absolutely essential. Now, in fairness, the governor has made a vast number of compromises, but the Republicans still say no new revenue. Well, my heavens. Their own package contains bagloads of tax increases. So let's be honest. So we have broken the barrier that there will be tax increases either way. Whether you take the Dayton plan, you take the Republican plan, there are tax increases. It's just a question of how much and who pays. That lends itself to a pragmatic solution. So let's stop the pretense of some higher power ordaining that taxes will not be raised.
Okay. The media. We talked about the media before,
right.
And you talked about how the media has changed. And we can, in terms of Minnesota media, how good a job do you think Minnesota media has done since you left office in 1999, both generally and specifically related to the budget situation we find ourselves in today?
Yeah. Very fair question. First of all, in order for a democracy to be successful, it also needs a very successful media. And by that I mean a real focus on information and knowledge, and far less focus, and I'm talking about big-time media, far less focus on politics and confrontation and controversy. Right now, if you turn on national television, it's a screaming match. And it's the art of the simple. If you increase taxes, jobs are lost. Woo, woo, woo. Who decided that was a great truth? Let's start to be truthful. Let's start to be more substantive and not reduce everything to a 15-second soundbite. I like this kind of a conversation far, far better than somebody clipping me after 15 seconds. Now, newspapers have been badly hit economically. And we depend upon newspapers for the bulk of our information. And when you start to retire your more senior reporters, more knowledgeable reporters, as has happened, and replace them with lower cost, newer reporters, that does affect the quality of news. And I would say that's one of the larger changes that has occurred.
What do you think having a weak media does to to politicians in terms of, holding them accountable?
Well, it weakens accountability all over the place. There's no question about it. It allows for a sharp rise in demagoguery, and you can get away with almost anything. Whatever your viewpoint, you can find some channel, some radio station, that, or even a newspaper that will reveal it. You see this now in the unfolding of the Murdoch scandal, of how far we will go to get, quote, a story, which is downright vicious.
Well, and you had talked about how, we might not, this government shutdown shouldn't be a surprise to us. And if we, and you said that some of the people in the media knew that there was budget gimmickry happening back in the early 2000s. Yeah. So do you think that would have made a difference? I
think it would have made a huge difference. I mean, I hate to be one of those people who longs for the good old days, but in the good old days, you would have seen comparison stories. This is the governor's budget, this is what he wants, this is the Republican budget, this is what they want, this is what Democrats in the legislature want, this is and then, a lot of local officials, etc. You want leadership from all segments of your community. I really want business leaders to participate. I want community leaders to participate. I want educational leaders to participate, not just talking about their budgets, but talking about the totality of society. Because we in Minnesota like our quality of life. I just would like to see us focus infinitely more on substance, far less on labeling, and far less on confrontation. Okay.
Do you have any thoughts on, we're all wondering when this thing could end. Some people are saying it could last a long time. Any thoughts on when this thing could end?
Well, I'm truthfully hopeful that either Dayton or the legislature will embrace the third alternative, because that, frankly, is the most pragmatic, the most sensible, and it's the only one that actually looks to the future. By recognizing debt and recognizing the obligation to pay off that debt and restore some fiscal sanity to our K-12 education system. I personally intend to continue to work on that. I've talked to Vice President Mondale. He intends to continue to work on that. And I noticed the Winona paper endorsed it. So it's slowly catching on, but I'll admit it is slow. But right now, when you have this firm attitude on revenue on one side and no negotiations, nothing to compromise, no. In fairness, I do think Governor Dayton has put a number of compromises on the table. I think now it's up to the Republicans to put some compromises. And instead of criticizing our commission's report, come out and tell us precisely what is it they are for.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining me, Governor.
No, I'm delighted. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for joining us on Hey, Let's Talk on Fridays. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you later.